It'll be over soon. The water will sleep again.
After making that video on Imaginary, there was another movie that was floating around in my head because they came out within a relatively close time frame to each other and are used in the same breath as examples of bad Blumhouse films of recent times. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Night Swim is good, but I honestly think it's a little unfair to put these two right next to each other because Night Swim, at the very least, had sprinkles of a competent story and doesn't feel like it was written by a computer. Full transparency, when I first heard the concept of a horror movie focusing on a swimming pool at night, I didn't totally hate it. It wasn't the fanciest thing, but I did have a pool at my house as a kid, and I can remember the feeling of being in that thing at night and wondering what might be hiding under the surface or inside the vents. I got scared of it a fair bit, and there was a particular feeling to that I thought had some potential, although it's something that I figured would work best as a short film and not as a feature, and that's originally what this was. Bryce McGuire, the writer and director of Night Swim, made a short film back in 2014 with the same title, and it was a pretty big success when he put it up on YouTube. James Wan, the one and only, eventually saw the short and bought the concept, bringing McGuire along to write and direct the feature-length adaptation. This concept works as a short because it's a very simple idea about the inky abyss you see when looking into a pool at night. You have that kind of like dark underbelly of the suburb vibe to this. Where it all falls apart is when you now need to somehow stretch that simple idea to around 90 minutes. McGuire, to his credit, actually does manage some decent material through the first half of the film, but the concept feels like Bilbo at the start of Fellowship of the Ring.
I feel thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread.
It also suffers from having a concept that, while a darker tone can work for a short, probably would be best served by something that didn't take itself very seriously for a feature-length film. For a throwback to the video that changed the trajectory of this channel forever, it's a haunted fucking pool. Let's dive in, shall we?
We have a pool.
I want to get one thing out of the way. Mark Corvin did the score for this movie. Yeah, you heard me right. The same Mark Corvin who scored The Witch, The Lighthouse, The First Omen, The Black Phone, and who I have constantly gushed over in many videos, did the music for the Haunted Pool movie. The score is good because I don't think Corvin is capable of making a bad one, but it just goes to show that even a good score can be completely forgettable if it's not accompanied by a film that can hold its own. With that out of the way, the film stars Wyatt Russell and Kerry Condon, both of which are actors who I like a lot. Hell, Kerry was in Better Call Saul, which is an S-tier character drama, and Wyatt Russell sure as hell has his dad's DNA, and he's done a lot of great work, so it shouldn't really come as any surprise that their relationship is the highlight of the film. I'm gonna do something that may be surprising here. I'm gonna spend some time praising Night Swim, because there are a couple of elements of the first act that I thought were not half bad. Wyatt Russell's character Ray is a retired professional baseball player as he's been diagnosed with MS, and I thought the way they handled where he's at this point of his life was like actually really good. They did a great job of making you feel the yearning he has for the life that's behind him and the sadness he has about how his illness is restricting him. They're looking for a new home, and the big thing that's being focused on is how close it is to medical facilities and the accessibility of it, and he's tired of the care he needs being such a defining part of his everyday life. Of course, it has to be, but it's a nice point of characterization. One detail that I thought was genuinely great is when they're out driving and he's looking at the families out in the front yards of a particular neighborhood. He sees a father playing with his kids with a vigor that he doesn't have anymore. He's seeing the life that he wants. And with them front-loading all of that medical stuff and then contrasting it with him looking at this, it's a nice way to immerse the viewer in his state of mind. Now, here's the thing. With that being a plot point that has some genuine emotion to it that I think they handled well, Doesn't that feel a little out of place in a movie about a haunted fucking pool? I find the opening of this movie to be rather confusing because the opening title card feels like it's setting up a movie that's going to be a bit more, cheesy, which would fit the idea well, but that's not where it goes at all. The story deals with some heavy subject matter, like the debilitating illness that Ray is struggling with, intense grief, addiction. They're going down a path of trying to explore things that are very serious, and it feels completely out of place. Where it gets really frustrating is that the way they choose to reconcile these two things winds up causing a lot of dissonance in the movie's scares, because the idea is that this pool is connected to groundwater, and the water in this area has apparently had magical healing properties for a long, long time. So when Ray starts going in the water, he begins recovering from the MS. The way it all works, though, is that when this water uses its healing abilities, it essentially needs repayment in the form of someone else being taken into the depths of its abyss. It's a bit of a contrived concept, but it's not the idea itself that's the main issue, it's the way that idea is expanded on and how little they actually capitalize on this concept. The movie starts out being a decent watch with some solid performances and a good character setup, but it quickly devolves into a by-the-numbers haunted house flick where the ancient haunted spring water is nothing more than set dressing. It's basically the Amityville horror where Ray is slowly taken over by this thing, but where it gets really irritating to me is how this affects the feeling of the scares. In a vacuum, they're not terrible, mostly. I like some of the vague, blurry imagery we see of the spirits, although it's definitely one of those things where it's just there for the audience. It doesn't actually make sense in the context of the film, like why would it be manifesting right now? But what really bothered me is that if this water is motivated to coax people into bathing in it so it can pull them into the abyss, then it makes no fucking sense for it to scare anyone who gets near it. It pulling Ray in at the start somewhat makes sense, since it's giving him a little taste that probably made him more drawn to stay here, but it also then makes it seem really stupid as things go on, with it almost killing Ray when he first arrives, forcing him to nearly drown a kid in the pool, which obviously was never going to work because of how many other people are around, and then scaring the mom and the kids because that's only motivation for them to move out of the house. But this is a white family and a horror movie, so I suppose that was never in the cards anyway. It's a really frustrating watch because it feels like they had this concept that they either weren't willing or weren't allowed to fully commit to because they needed to have one of those typical Blumhouse-style haunted house movies with those Conjuring-esque scares that don't make any sense in the context of the film's story. The Conjuring was a movie dealing with poltergeists and witchcraft, so it didn't feel out of place, but here, these scares are so forced and ultimately meaningless because they don't actually result in anything. They just happen periodically to keep up appearances, and I don't think that a single scare in the movie is even remotely memorable, save for maybe the Marco Polo scene, solely because the design of the thing that jump scares Izzy is kind of crazy, I guess. It feels like there was this idea of a much more intimate and character-driven story, but it winds up only really being used for the first half to get things rolling on what turns into a standard haunted house movie. And then Ray becomes extremely peripheral after that, while Eve does her discount the Ring-style investigative work. Imaginary is really stupid, like bafflingly dumb. But it's so fucking dumb that it can be entertaining entirely because of that. Night Swim, on the other hand, is not as confoundedly inept. It's just really dull and frustrating and feels like it can't decide what movie it wants to be. It focuses so much time through the first half on Ray's recovery that you'd expect his struggle with this would be used as an allegory for addiction or desperation, but it's really just used as setup and then gets sidelined. It seems like they weren't even able to choose which theme they wanted to actually focus on for him, since the end of the movie comes out with this random sacrifice angle that had zero setup and doesn't come anywhere near aligning with the way they were handling his arc prior to this. It's completely out of nowhere. It seems like they threw in this idea of him trying to get redemption for being a bad father by sacrificing himself for his kids, or at least not a present father, but he was never shown to be like that. He seemed like a perfectly present, caring, compassionate, helpful dude who just wasn't able to engage the way he wanted to because of his illness. It's such an unfocused story, and that's partially because of the lengths they had to go to take this concept beyond a short film, but it's also just because they didn't commit to anything and wound up making what feels like two different takes on the story. You had the slow recovery and growing obsession with Ray through the first half, then he's shoved off to the side while the kids and the mum get some scare scenes and she goes to learn about the history of the thing. It's an almost laughably predictable story structure. Like, the literal second she goes to the house of the mother of the previous victim of the water, you know to a T how it's going to play out. She's used as nothing more than an exposition dump, and thankfully the previous person to live in the house knows the deep history of the water in that specific area, so she can just throw all of that into our hands before the third act kicks off. And it makes a ton of sense that she would do that deep dive, considering she's completely repressing what happened and won't even acknowledge that she used to have a daughter. And it makes a lot of sense that someone who is repressing their own memory would take a very long time to look into the specific thing and learn all of the intricacies and how it works. That's very convenient. It's a really lazy way to get the story across. It's been done so many times, and it's almost always one of my least favorite parts of a movie when it happens. For such a contrived and bland way to reveal information, it's amazing to me that it continues to happen so many times in ghost stories. You introduce a bland new character who's experienced this before, they're all messed up and weird, they give a big info dump that reveals some game-changing information, then they go all wacky. Please stop fucking doing this. The thing I didn't mention is not only do they check off that cliche box and the scares feel so by the numbers and nonsensical in the context of this story, they also had the overdone opening scene of having another character experience the tail end of the haunting that our actual characters are going to experience. This is very hard to justify for any other reason than the creators being afraid of losing the intended audience if they don't have something scary in the first 5 or 10 minutes, but they don't want to reveal any threat to our main characters too early on. So we just throw in some people who have absolutely no impact on the rest of the story, get some scares out of the way, and then we can move on and start the actual movie. My brain's not functioning right now. Sure, the person we get the info dump from is the mother of the kid who gets got at the start, but there was no reason whatsoever to show this scene other than that and, you know, the early scares. And I don't think either of those things add anything. I'm gonna lean into me really overthinking a movie about a haunted pool for a second and say that another reason why this opening scene bothers me so much is because it's clearly meant to cater to an audience that is just there for a jump scare simulator. But then the first half of the movie takes its time and is dealing with a lot of character-driven stuff that audience would have no interest in anyway. So once again, total lack of focus. It's not only a lack of focus in what the story is trying to do, but also in the intended audience of the film, because the people who will tap out within 10 minutes if there aren't any scares, and the people who want to see emotional character development are generally not going to be in the same crowd. This movie is so frustrating. That's the big thing that's important to note, because I was praising the first half of the movie a fair bit earlier. It's still got some major issues early on, it's just that there were also things that I was surprised by that I liked, and I felt like those were worth talking about, because you get these kinds of movies and you only usually ever hear about the bad with them, but it's very rare to find a movie that truly has nothing good. We have all these unmotivated scares, like the shadow of this spirit that only we can see. Zero reason for that to be there. One of the things that I did kind of enjoy was the voices coming from the vents in the pool, which I think does capitalize on the idea of the movie a little more than most of the scares they go for, but I don't know, man, there's just not a whole lot you can do with this kind of thing. So it just feels like they're treading water with these basic scares to bide their time until the movie can eventually reach its climax that really just devolves into the third act of a cheap Amityville horror ripoff for the most part. It's also like, there are these really dumb moments where it feels like they were trying to figure out ways to make this idea seem cooler than it actually is. Like this sequence where Ray agrees to come help coach some of the young baseball players, and he's having a hard time hitting the ball because of his illness, and so he channels the pool in his mind. This professional baseball player just channeled an in-ground suburban swimming pool to gain superpowers. I imagine that this is how rich people amp themselves up for things. The scene where he tries to drown that kid during the pool party may make it seem like he's possessed, but from what I've heard, this dude said Doom Eternal gives no player creativity and forces you to play one way, so I think this was probably just a corrective measure, and a justified one at that. He also said that Nosferatu was just a horny vampire movie, and that Haunting of Hill House was boring. Don't look at me like that, he's the one who said it. It's being taken care of. Another thing I haven't even mentioned yet, some of the dialogue in this movie is horrible.
The water chose him.
The stuff early on is decent, especially between Ray and Eve, who again, I thought had pretty damn good chemistry between them and I enjoyed their banter, but once Ray's possession starts to worsen or we're in that bullshit info dump scene, for the love of Hidetaka Miyazaki, it is just atrocious.
There's something wrong with that pool.
Eve, there's nothing wrong with the pool. The pool's fine.
I'm starting to wonder if Blumhouse has a storage closet full of generic horror dialogue that anyone who's making a movie under them can just come in and grab and rework slightly and call it a day. We call it the closet of yearly release quotas. Then there's the thing that's always pretty annoying in movies where kids are written in a much more mature way than you'd actually see, but here it's honestly worse than it usually is. Remember how I said this movie's scares are meaningless? Well, there is a scene so egregious that it's almost impressive, where you can feel the script starting to, scramble to justify having scare scenes early on without alerting Ray or Eve to the fact that there's something bad going on here. It's the same sort of issue I have with this kind of cold open, but this is way worse because they already did it once, and now they're just bending logic in a nearly commendable way. So both kids, Elliot and Izzy, have experienced something very blatantly haunted in this pool. Elliot was playing a coin toss game and followed the coins being thrown in from above the water, thinking it was his dad doing it, but it's actually a spirit leading him further into the depths for some reason. Again, the thing is trying to heal Ray and then get a sacrifice in return, so drowning someone now doesn't do anything. Of course, he doesn't drown, and he has that encounter that I referred to earlier where he hears the voice of someone in the vent. Honestly, there are some things about this scene that I don't mind, and I like the idea of this bright summer day in a quiet backyard with a spirit tossing the coins in. There's an atmosphere to that I can appreciate. Of course, the whole thing culminates in a jump scare with no payoff, but now Elliot has seen some spooky shit out here and knows it's haunted. Izzy winds up having this guy over when her parents are out and they play Marco Polo, which was the scene they used for a fair bit of the marketing and was the only teaser I saw for the movie. He plays fish out of water and Izzy gets pulled under eventually, where we get our first taste of the fucking pool void that comes into play later on. Spooky faces, dark shit, you know the drill. I do like the idea that Izzy isn't sure at first of what she experienced, because if you did get your foot caught in something, it could make the water feel much deeper. But there's too much breathing room in this scene, so to speak, for me to buy that. So now, Izzy and Elliot both know that the pool is haunted. And Elliot can tell that Izzy also experienced something. So he says they should tell their parents. Yes. Yes, you should. Your dad almost drowned in there. Beat one. Shit's going wrong constantly. This thing is to blame. The actual writing in the scene is bad, but it's the egregious nature of what this scene exists for that bothers me a lot more. Izzy says that they shouldn't say anything because Mum's having a hard enough time as it is. Yeah, I'm sure the haunted pool that tried to kill both of her children and her husband has no potential to make her have a harder time. This whole scene is only here so that they can get some scares in and then not have to deal with the actual narrative implications that come from characters being exposed to this stuff too early on. It's infuriating and just further heightens that feeling of nothing in this movie actually having any payoff. It's all just set dressing for cheap scares. Do you notice how I seem to be going slowly crazy as this video has gone on? Like the very life behind my eyes is slipping away and in its place is a dizzying spiral of nonsense. That's because while the movie doesn't start out amazing by any means, the longer it goes on and the less they do with the concept, the more bland and dull and nauseating the experience becomes. And I think I needed more time after losing my grip on reality during that imaginary video before jumping into another one that makes me turn into Stephen Hawking gum from Sausage Party as I feel the very matter of my being melting away. So essentially, where it all winds up leading to is that through Ray's healing coming from the water, it essentially needs repayment in the form of one of his children. There's so much of this movie that feels like it's just biding time, and then you'd at least hope that after all that they could have a really cool climax to give some sense of payoff. But no. It's just a standard cat and mouse scene with Ray and Izzy where that horrible dialogue shows itself once again.
Life is too hard for Elliot. It's better this way.
Elliot gets pulled down to the water as the sacrifice. Eve saves him. They realize that they can't leave without someone dying, and so Ray sacrifices himself and kills off any semblance of a thematically consistent arc for his character. The final scene of the movie has them filling in the pool so that this will never happen again, and then when the credits roll, there's this bizarre tonal whiplash. We've been watching what's selling itself as a sad, emotional story about family. No one really shows any emotion for having just lost their dad. And then this is the credits sequence they went with. Why? Look, man, Blumhouse gets a lot of well-deserved shit, but there is something they do that I like a lot. They give opportunities for smaller directors to work with a solid budget, and they've given people who would have a really hard time getting their movie made the chance to do it. I love that. I know they've never been perfect, but it feels like there used to be a lot more bangers that they'd come out with alongside this stuff. But these days, that's just becoming less the case. Night Swim is not without its merits, particularly through the first act of the film, but overall, it is such a cheap, unfocused delivery mechanism for unearned jump scares with remnants of a story stitched together to expand what worked best as a short film out way beyond its limits. The performances are rather good and some of the dynamics were enjoyable, but the movie itself is so void of anything interesting once you realize how much of it is just being phoned in, and then it turns into an extremely dull retread of things we've seen way too many times before and things which have been done much better in other movies. It's hooey, I tell you. Hooey! Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.